Now, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce you our distinguished guest speaker tonight. Dr. Johanna Blakley is the Managing Director and Director of Research at Norman Gear's Lear Center, a research and public policy institute that explores convergence of entertainment, commerce, and society. Based at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, Dr. Blakley performs research on a variety of topics, including global entertainment, cultural diplomacy, celebrity culture, fashion, digital media, and intellectual property law. She has 2 talks on TED.com, which have logged over 500,000 viewers. She speaks frequently in the US and abroad about her research, and her work has been cited in numerous publications, including New York Times Magazine's The Economist, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, Politico, Huffington Post, Business Week, and PR Week. She has appeared on Good Morning America, MSNBC, and Current TV, and on several radio programs, including The Planet Money and Marketplace. Dr. Blakley has overseen 2 major research initiatives about the impact of intellectual property rights on innovation and creativity. She is a regular contributor to the Lear Center blog, and she has guided more than 40 manuscripts through the publication process at the Lear Center, including The Warner's War, Propaganda, Politics, and Pop Culture in Wartime Hollywood. Blakley developed course materials on cultural diplomacy for the Masters in Public Diplomacy at Annenberg, and she is currently co-directing a university-wide research initiatives on creativity and collaboration in the academy. She received a doctoral degree in English from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Blakley has held a variety of positions with the high-tech industry. She serves on numerous advisory boards, is a fellow at the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities. You're in for a great treat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Johanna Blakley.
Hello, everybody. Oh, I'm going to use this mic. That's right. Thank you so much for having me. I was really thrilled to get the invitation because I went to an honors college myself at the University of Oregon, and it really changed my life. I always tell people, if I end up with any money when I'm dead, they're getting it, because they really helped me sort of catch up on what I'd missed. I went to a very small rural high school, and that honors college was key to my academic career. So I hope this program does the same sort of magic for you. Okay, today I'm going to talk about fashion and the democracy of style. It turns out that a lot of people don't realize that in the fashion industry, fashion designers have very little intellectual property protection. That is, they make these designs, right? Very unique designs. You can look around the room, everybody's wearing them, and they don't own them. Anybody can knock them off and make a copy and put their own trademark in the back. They don't have to talk to a lawyer or get a license in order to do it. You cannot copyright any fashion designs. What they do have is trademark protection. So that's the label in the back of your outfit, that's the logo that's on your purse, and this is what they own. And trademark protection is very important because what it does is it signals to a consumer who made something. And that's especially important in an industry like fashion, where it's all about taste. It's all about aesthetics. You want to know who made it. And so trademark is very important to fashion designers. They can protect it. They can sue people who steal their trademark. And it's something that they're quite aggressive about all around the world. And it's one reason that you see logos splattered all over everything. It's because the copyists, the people who could make copies of this hat or that purse or that bracelet or that belt, they're not allowed to copy the logo. So many designers have been very clever, and they have integrated the actual logo or trademark that they own into the design of the garment. But it's also why you see weird stuff like this, right? It's like they think, well, if I make it just a little bit different, it'll still have that feel like it's Nike or it's Prada or it's Gucci, but I won't get in trouble with the authorities because it's really not. Now, the reason that fashion designers don't qualify for copyright protection, and this is basically the case all around the world, but I'll be talking most specifically about the United States, is that the courts believe that fashion designs are simply too utilitarian. Everybody has to wear stuff to cover up their naked body, and they don't want anybody claiming that they own a certain kind of pleat or a certain skirt of a certain length or a certain pinstripe suit or a collar or a cuff. Imagine if a fashion designer had to license all the different bits and pieces of a dress. It would be crazy. And so the courts generally have said, no, we're not going to give it to you. But the ironic thing is that none of us think of fashion as being too utilitarian. Who among you thinks of fashion as being really utilitarian? That's just not the way we think about it or talk about it. We think about fashion as being frivolous, something that we do kind of for fun and out of vanity. And sometimes there's absolutely nothing utilitarian about the objects that these designers make. This is Vivienne Westwood, who I adore, but I would never walk in those, never. Now, for some of you, this may seem very strange that there's no copyright protection in the fashion industry. These are very creative people. They make all their money from their creative designs, but they don't own them. The basic sort of reason that we have copyright protection is because of this justification, that without ownership, there is no incentive to innovate. And if that's your understanding of why it is that we have intellectual property laws like copyright protection, then the fashion industry is going to be a little confusing because it basically is a critically acclaimed industry where people are doing very artistic work, and it's a very successful commercial industry. What I'm going to argue today is that, sort of counterintuitively, the fact that the fashion industry does not have copyright protection, unlike musicians and sculptors and painters and graphic designers, and he's keeping up pretty well, isn't he? Yes, he is. Thank you. Unlike all those other artists in the world, fashion designers do not have copyright protection. And it actually affords them a chance to make these utilitarian objects into something very artful. So I'm going to claim that there's actually a connection between a lack of ownership and an incentive to be innovative. And these pictures that just cycled through right here, I think all of them except for one are actually in the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They're literally art objects, but the artists don't own them. Now, how many of you have heard of the Creative Commons? Can I see a show of hands? I just want a sense for how widespread. Okay, not even 20%. Well, it's a very interesting idea that emerged here in the States by some very smart people. What they wanted to do is come up with a legal licensing system that would allow creative people in all of these fields up here on the screen to actually voluntarily limit some of the copyrights, some of the copyright protection that they have on their work. When you scribble a doodle on a napkin, you automatically have copyright protection on that doodle. Well, some people might not want all that protection. For instance, a musician might want to release a song online in an MP3 format and give it a Creative Commons license that would allow people to share it freely. Maybe they want to market themselves, they want to spread their work around. They don't want people to be afraid that they would be doing something illegal if they should share the file with somebody without consulting the musician, because that's what copyright says, is you cannot share a file without asking permission. You can't make an illegal copy. A teacher for instance, may put together a whole set of curriculum, right? And say, I don't want this copyright protected. I want to be able to share it with people. I want kids in third world countries to be able to use this curriculum. And I don't want somebody pretending like it can't be copied. So there's a series of different kinds of Creative Commons licenses that people like this can use. Software programmers use these licenses as well when they want to invite assistance from other programmers to alter the code without going through the process of asking permission. So you might think, well, how can you make any money if you're giving stuff away? If you're letting people use your creative material without your express permission? And this is where fashion sort of comes into play for me. I see fashion as an example of an industry that demonstrates that sometimes strict ownership regimes are not the best way to monetize things, to sell goods, or to increase innovation. That a lack of ownership can also be a kind of incentive. So I'm going to take a look at the fashion industry, how it works, in what way it has been affected and changed by the fact that designers don't own the stuff they make. First, fashion designers have the pleasure of sampling from the entire history of fashion design and from current contemporary fashions with every design that they make. They don't have to talk to a lawyer. Imagine if a musician could do that. Musicians cannot sample from other people's work and incorporate it into their own. They have to talk to a lawyer, they have to license it, and they have to pay a fee. And it can be an extremely expensive process. The other thing that happens because people can copy one another and steal things from other people's designs is that you see trends develop. Certain colors catch on, certain styles, certain hem lengths. All of this is exacerbated by the fact that it's okay to steal from other people. So you find that a lot of people start homing in on a certain kind of design, a certain kind of aesthetic, and we literally have these trend forecasters who tell us where the needle is moving. Now, of course, there's some people who have a tremendous amount of power to dictate some of the trends that we see unfolding around the world. There are people who have, brilliant ideas, they have huge marketing machines working for them, and they're able to affect the trend cycle as it unfolds. But if you read any interviews with any designers or talk to any fashion designers, they will always inevitably say at some point, oh, well, I get so much inspiration from the street. I get so much inspiration from people that I see in the city that I live in. Because on the street is a sort of petri dish, right? Of all these people experimenting with different looks and trying to be fashionable, mixing and matching, vintage with something from Target and some expensive piece of Dior that they inherited from their grandmother. And this kind of thing really excites fashion designers because if they get disconnected from the street, they can't sell anything. So it's a very interesting industry where people are constantly sort of riffing off one another, sampling one another, remixing, and it's both top-down and bottom-up. Now, the fast fashion industry, how many of you have shopped at any of these stores? I do. The fast fashion industry, as it's called, has taken the clearest and most obvious advantage of the fact that these brilliant fashion designers don't own what they make. So these companies will very quickly and cheaply knock off the looks that they think will sell to their customers. So they look at the runway shows, and for Zara, I think the turnaround is like 16 days. They have a little room outside of Barcelona, with a group of designers there who figure out what's going to work for their clientele, and they base it all on the latest runway shows. But some designers, of course, are angry about this. They don't want their work being watered down and sold in cheaper materials, and they don't get a licensing fee, they don't get a cut, they don't get a reference, nothing. But generally, the courts have not agreed with them when designers have said, I need some protection. You shouldn't let people do this to me. And one reason the courts have not granted them this protection is because they have not been able to prove that there's been, that they've lost any money because of it. In fact, quite often, the opposite is what happens. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But it doesn't seem intuitive, does it? You know, if you see a pair of shoes, these are some Givenchy Gladiator ankle boots that were popular a couple years ago. They'd retail for $995. And then you see this knockoff from Steve Madden. They just cost $200. And they look very, very similar. And you think, how on earth can these luxury brands stay in business when such good knockoffs are available everywhere? Well, it's a question we asked, and we decided to have a conference at the University of Southern California where we brought together fashion designers, television producers, trend forecasters, people from the film industry and publishing, all the creative industries that are sort of struggling with copyright protection. And we focused on the fashion industry. And one person we asked to come was Tom Ford, who is a very well-respected fashion designer. Right now, if you open up any Vogue magazine or Elle, you're going to see a gorgeous picture of him. He is quite hot. Quite hot. And he had just stepped down as creative director at Gucci. And he had just made Gucci a powerhouse while he was there. So we asked him, you know, are you upset about all these copies? Why hasn't it hurt your business? And here's what he had to say.
And we found after much research that actually, not much research, quite simple research, that the counterfeit customer was not our customer.
Like, it really didn't take them long to figure out that the people who go into the Gucci boutique are not really the people who buy a lot of Zara, right? These are people who can afford to spend $3,000 on a jacket. And so they're not going to wear a $60 version of it. So they found that these fast fashion giants were not really cannibalizing their sales. In fact, people became more aware of the work of people like Tom Ford and the brand Gucci because they were able to buy knockoffs. And for some people, this became a kind of gateway drug, right? Like, I got something that sort of looks like Gucci, but now I want the real thing, I want the real thing. And so Tom Ford very much recognized that this was the dynamic, and he was also quite gratified when his work was knocked off, which it was knocked off like crazy. It was so popular, really sleazy sort of 70s outfits. He loved it because he felt like it meant he had succeeded. That he had managed to put his finger on the pulse. He'd got it right. If people were stealing from him, that meant he was on the right track. And you know, one thing about knockoffs is that they may look very similar, like the Steve Madden versus, you know, the Givenchy heels that I just showed you. But you know, once you feel these things, you can tell they're really different. The luxury items are made out of very chic and delicious and expensive materials. They don't feel the same. They don't wear the same way. Knockoffs are not the same as the original item. But sometimes the knockoff is actually kind of cuter than the original one, I think. I'm a bargain hunter, so I'm happy to try anything. So I think it's pretty clear that there are several virtues to copying, and I think a lot of people wouldn't assume that that's the case. First, and this gets at the theme of your honors colloquium this year, is many people would call it the democratization of fashion. When you make fashion available at more price points than it's ever been available at before, you are sort of opening the door to the masses. You're allowing people to participate in a world of fashion that was really not available to them even just 20 years ago. Our choices were much more limited. Now, it's kind of hard to tell on the street who's rich and who's poor. If you know how to put a look together, you can look quite amazing. And some people might think, oh, well, that's just vanity. You know, what does that really mean? How important is that really in society? Well, whether we like it or not, what we wear communicates a huge amount of information to everyone around us about what we think about ourselves, what we think about them, what we think about the event that we're attending. And humans are incredibly good at decoding this information. So, in my mind, having a broader palette to choose from is a very important aspect of expressing ourselves as humans. Because of the fast fashion industry, too, the development of global trends, that cycle has sped up. And that's actually good news for the fashion industry. Here we go. Because when a trend changes, what happens? People have to buy more clothes. They have to buy something else. And so in the fashion industry, they want the trend cycle to be as fast as possible. They want to make sure that people want to buy more clothes. Now, the people who consider themselves fashionistas, people who think of themselves as being fashionable, they have to be slightly ahead of the curve. They can't be wearing what everybody else is wearing. So once a trend disseminates, the meme catches on, you see a certain look, everybody's wearing it, the fashionista has got to move on to the next thing. That's good for sales. And what happens is that designers constantly have to try to figure out what is the next new thing? How can I get ahead of the curve? It's very rare that you have the same designers sort of at the cutting edge in each season. It usually shifts around very unpredictably. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, to have your finger on the pulse, something that Tom Ford was very, very good at. And so this actually ends up accelerating the whole cycle of creative innovation. As I often say, there's really no rest for the fashionable. Now, Stuart Weitzman is a popular American shoe designer, and he has complained bitterly about people knocking off his designs. So he's not happy about this situation at all. But I read this interview with him. I was fascinated. It was about these shoes. I think it's called the Bowden heel. And he said, well, usually I would come up with an interesting heel like this or some sort of special design that I would only share with my shoe designers as a kind of inspiration. You know, like those special cars, you know, automobiles that are never made available to the public, but it's a concept car. Well, this was a concept shoe. He's like, wait a second, I could actually sell this shoe, and it would be really hard to knock it off because the heel has to be made out of steel or titanium in order to not crack and give in when somebody walks on it. So if somebody tried to make a copy of it in a cheaper material like plastic, it literally wouldn't be wearable as a shoe. So it forced him to actually release to the public something that was more innovative than anything he's made before. And what he was trying to do was to make something that was too difficult to copy. Now this, strangely enough, reminded me of an anecdote I had heard about Charlie Parker, the jazz genius. He claimed that he invented bebop music, a certain subgenre of jazz, because he was convinced that white people would be incapable of playing it. He was furious that white musicians were constantly stealing his work, and white musicians had more access to more clubs because of segregation. So he thought, I'm going to make something that's too difficult for them to copy. Now, just because you can copy in the fashion industry does not mean it's always okay to copy. If you want to be a serious fashion designer, you have to have a signature style. You have to have a certain kind of aesthetic that people recognize as yours. And one of the main reasons you need to do that is because if you can articulate a certain vision, a certain look where anybody would say, ah, that's Alexander McQueen, then if anybody knocks you off or steals your look, everybody knows. So it's very important in an industry like this, where you don't own what you make, is that you develop a reputation and that people connect your vision and the objects that you make to that signature style. And that's a little bit like comedians. I don't know if you know that you can't copyright a joke either. So during the days of vaudeville, for instance, people told a lot of one-liner jokes, and the comics would steal jokes from one another all the time. And you know, vicious battles are so angry about it, stealing material. What you've seen in that industry is a sort of evolution towards a signature style, right? Chris Rock has a certain delivery, a certain voice. certain kind of material that suits him. When somebody else steals it, you can kind of tell. Same with Larry David. Imagine Larry David telling Chris Rock jokes. Or Chris Rock telling Larry David jokes. It does not work. With fashion design, it's a similar thing. They have a certain aesthetic, a certain vision. You can see Prada making it. Tom Ford wouldn't touch it. The other way that fashion designers have sort of cleverly dealt with this lack of ownership is that they copy themselves. They're like, okay, if Target is going to knock me off, if H&M is going to knock me off, well, hell, I'll do it myself. So they've attracted absolutely A-plus, top-level designers. This is Karl Lagerfeld from Chanel. He did a line for H&M, which sold out immediately. You probably maybe saw in the papers recently that Missoni, the famous Italian brand, finally did a partnership with Target. I have been waiting forever for that to happen. They crashed all the servers at Target because people were so desperate to get a piece of Missoni for like 16 bucks. That had never been possible in the past. And now Missoni's brand value is soaring. All these people have been introduced to the gateway drug of Missoni, and now they want to go to the boutique. Just a bikini, just a bikini. Often when you talk to designers here in the States about this copyright issue, and it's a sensitive issue with a lot of them, as you can imagine, they're artists, you know, they're like, why don't I get the protection like other artists? It's insulting. Right? They'll often say, well, in Europe, they have protection. You know, why don't we? In other places, they do respect fashion design. And so I went out of my way to sort of look at the other largest markets around the world and see, well, how do they do it? How do they offer protection? Japan is the third largest fashion market in the world, and it turns out they have a design law in place. It's not exactly copyright, but it's a protection that's offered for apparel. But, and this is a big but, you have to prove that the garment that you get registered for protection is completely unique. It's unlike any other thing that's ever been made before. And guess what? That's really hard. So they basically don't have any protection. In the European Union, you have kind of the opposite problem. They put together something they call a community design system, and apparel is eligible for registration, but you find very few of the designers actually registering anything. And it's strange because, of course, there's a huge haute couture industry in Europe, and that's where the fast fashion industry was actually born. H&M is from Sweden, Topshop is from London, and Zara is from Spain. But you hardly see any lawsuits, and you don't see many things registered. And you have to wonder, well, why? Well, it turns out that the novelty standard, what made it impossible to get protection in Japan, is too weak in the European Union. The novelty standard is so low that all of these Nike t-shirts are registered as separate, unique designs. So imagine, you could pretty easily make another shirt. This is a slightly different color, or maybe the sleeve's a little bit longer. Maybe you make the checks a different color, and you could register it as your unique design. So basically, you have no protection at all. Somebody would just have to make a tiny change, and they too would say that they have a unique design. So I haven't been able to find a system anywhere that works. But that has not stopped the Council of Fashion Designers of America. Its president is Diane von Furstenberg. And they have been fighting like crazy in order to get copyright protection for fashion designers. I just watched a hearing at the US House of Representatives probably 2 months ago. They've introduced a bill, it's called the Innovative Design Protection and Piracy Prevention Act, blah, blah, blah. They call it IDP3. And what they're trying to do is get a level of protection, something like what you see in the European Union, which, as far as I can tell, does not work at all. So I've talked to people in DC, trade associations, different organizations that deal with a lot of the fashion companies all around the country. And I've asked them, what are you guys going to do if this passes? And there is a chance it will pass. Michelle Obama is behind it because she thinks, fashion designers deserve respect, right? Copyright is equivalent to respect. And that's the problem in the logic. It's not about respect. It's about incentivizing innovation. And so I've asked these people on the inside, what are you going to do if it passes? And they said, oh, we're going to tell all the companies to ignore it. We're going to tell the designers, just don't bother. There's no point in going to a judge and a jury and trying to decide who invented a dress and who's made a knockoff of it, because the trend cycle is too fast. We have to move product. We can't wait around for litigation. Well, it turns out that fashion is not the only industry, actually, that has very little copyright protection. It's also the case in the food industry. I was just at a great conference in Barcelona about food and fashion. That was very fun, I must say. You can't copyright a recipe. And you can't copyright the look and feel of a dish, even an artistic sort of dish like this. The only person who owns any sort of copyright in this situation is the person who took the picture of that dish. Same here. It doesn't matter how artful, how crazy your design is for an automobile, you do not own that look, that outline of the car. And I mean, in my mind, it's like, wow, that's the only thing I know about a car, is the outside and the way it looks. And none of those designers actually own that. It's the same with furniture. And the reason, sort of overarching reason for furniture and automobiles and fashion, they're too utilitarian. That's the underlying logic. Magicians do not own their tricks. Sort of like recipes. You can't copyright a recipe or a magic trick. You cannot copyright a hairdo. It's extremely complicated, the academic articles that I've read about hairdos and performance rights and copyright, very complicated, but there's no protection. Databases can be very hard to get copyright protection. You've probably heard of open source software. It's an interesting situation where computer programmers decided that to give up some of their copyright protection so that they could rewrite code with strangers, other programmers, so that they could optimize the code without asking for permission. Tattoos. This is just an odd little subculture because a tattoo is actually a design that does qualify for copyright protection because it's a two-dimensional illustration, right? But it's just not cool in the tattoo world to actually sue anybody over that. So people share designs, and there's a sort of an understanding. It's a reputation-based system. They don't sick lawyers on one another, typically. Jokes, as I mentioned, can't be copyrighted. Fireworks displays. Imagine all the work that goes into a really complicated fireworks display. And once again, the only person who owns any copyright to this is the photographer. And the logic, which is very interesting to me, is that it doesn't have a fixed physical presence. Because the fireworks dissipate and disappear, what do you copyright? There's nothing there. And sometimes the same argument is used for food, right? Even there's a crazy dish that took, days to make and all this innovation, somebody eats it. Or it rots. It doesn't have a physically fixed presence. The rules of games are not copyright protected. The two-dimensional design of the actual board is protected, so you can't steal that. But you could take the rules of Monopoly and create a new board and release it as a game of your own. Perfume. If you've ever wondered why there are those kiosks at the mall that sell the knockoffs of different kinds of perfume, well, the interesting thing is that you can have a patent protection for the chemical formula that you use to make a perfume, like Chanel No. 5, for instance, but you don't own the smell. Nobody owns the scent. So that means that other people can just put together chemicals until they come up with something that smells like Chanel No. 5. Now, some of you may be thinking that some of these industries are very marginal. Magic, tattoos, whatever. But if you take a look at some of the industries with very little intellectual property protection, like food and automobiles and fashion and furniture, I mean, these are massive, very serious global industries. And if you look at industries that have a great deal of intellectual property protection, and it tends to be expanding, industries like film and books and music, you see that these are much smaller industries. I just want to make it clear that the lack of copyright protection is not just taking place in frivolous industries that don't have economic heft, right? But I found in a lot of my research, I mean, I've talked to so many people in the fashion industry who study it and are in it, and they think of this as fashion's dirty little secret. They think of it as kind of embarrassing that fashion designers can steal from one another. They think that it sort of reinforces this sense that they're not serious artists. So they don't necessarily like to talk about it, and they don't think of it as this really revolutionary thing that I think it is. But I think it's time that we sort of let the cat out of the bag. This is a pretty interesting idea, especially in an environment where we have digital technology that is completely undermining industries that have always depended on copyright in order to make money. That's how the music industry has made its money, is by controlling copies of its work. That's a direct result of copyright protection. And guess what? That's not working so well for them now. So once I did all this research on fashion and intellectual property law, and I found out about all of these, they're called low IP industries, industries with low intellectual property protection. I thought, what is the underlying logic? What gets protection and what doesn't? And so I came up with this rubric, and I think it's accurate. I've passed it by a few lawyers. They haven't said boo about it. Generally, there's two key issues in place. First, is this something that is artistic, or is it something that's utilitarian? Oh, what a mess that is, right? Can't you think of a million things that are really artistic and utilitarian? Well, there you go. This is one of the key binary oppositions. So people decided at some point that film and music and photos and drama and literature are artistic, and culinary creations and fireworks and magic tricks and hairstyles are more utilitarian, right? So these are very blurry sorts of categories. On the other hand, the other binary opposition that's in play when things are considered for copyright protection is whether something is an idea. Ideas cannot be owned by any one person. They need to be shared in a free society. You can imagine how bad things would be if that weren't the case. But a physically fixed expression of an idea, a book, an essay, a CD, a song you make, a film, once you commit something to a material form, an idea to a material form, according to copyright law, you have the opportunity to own that for a certain period of time, 75 years plus the life of the author. But I think one of the things that's really made it difficult for us to understand this copyright logic is digital technology. It's really undermined our intuitive sense of what a physically fixed object is. Do we think of an MP3 file as a physically fixed object? A lot of us don't. We think of it as something that we can easily, infinitely copy and spread and give to people, and it doesn't seem like we're hurting anybody by doing that. It's the lack of obvious materiality that gives us this feeling that it's okay to share things. And it's exactly what the technology was made to do. And so we're at a crisis point where we have a legal system that's completely out of sync with a technology that almost all of us in this room use at least on an hourly basis. So there's something that needs to be resolved here. There's a lot that needs to be resolved. When you talk about ownership and creativity, you sort of open up a Pandora's box of complex issues, the kinds of issues that philosophers debate, right? And right now, this kind of discussion is really being held mostly you know, by lawyers. I like lawyers. I do like lawyers. My boyfriend is a lawyer. I'm not anti-lawyer. He's a good guy. He's smart. But this is too much for him. We need to all be engaged in this issue. The ownership of creativity is one of the most important things in human society. If you don't have the proper incentives in place to give creative people a chance to do something interesting, make something great that's going to change the world, then you're not going to progress as a society. And I think our system is a bit broken right now. So I'll let you know a little bit about the sort of future research that I would like to be involved in. I'd love to have you guys share your ideas with me and think about how you might be involved. First, think about how much you knew about intellectual property law when you came in the room today, and maybe how much more you might think you know now. I think a lot of people don't know anything about it, even creative people. I talk to faculty all the time. Faculty who write books and articles, they're very confused about what their rights are and whether copyright is really serving them well. They make very little money from the hundreds of hours of work that they put into, for instance, an academic essay. I think we need to take a closer look at these low intellectual property industries. They're not really discussed in the legal literature very much because there's no lawsuits, right? When you don't have intellectual property protection, then there's no case. So I think it's something that we need to investigate. How do these industries work? How could we make sure that industries that are sort of dying today because they have high intellectual property protection that they can't enforce, how might they take some lessons away from industries like fashion or food? I think there's a lot of creative people, especially young people, who would be very interested in experimenting with, artistic collectives, with open source code, with collaborative authoring. These are exciting new ideas that all of our new digital technologies enable. But the ownership issues are very complicated. We worry, how do we make any money doing this? I think these are models that we need to explore, and I think particularly in the university and college context is a place to experiment with these kinds of new ways of thinking about creativity and ownership. As I said, we cannot leave this to the lawyers. We need a clear understanding of human behavior, of evolutionary biology, of how the brain works in neuroscience. It will help us as a society to better understand what ownership models will create the best possible situation for creative people to thrive. And one thing that I'm adamant about is talking to creative people. And by artists, I don't just mean sculptors and painters and musicians. I mean people who are creating all the time. Architects, software engineers, all of these people are creating amazing things all the time. What do they think? What sort of ownership regime do they think would work best for them? What would elicit from them the best possible world-changing work? I don't think we're going to know until we talk to them. Now, if you want to know more about this project, you'll find a whole bunch of material on our website, readytoshare.org. And I just want to thank, for sure, my colleague Veronica Hodicke. She makes these wonderful slides for me that people think I make. I don't. She does it. So thank you very much for your time. All right, I believe we have a few minutes for Q&A, and what's going to happen is there's going to be 2 microphones, one up here, I think, and one back here. And if you'd like to ask a question, we'd ask that you sort of slither out of your row and go find one of the microphones. I know some people have to leave, so please go ahead. Did you want to go ahead, Eric?
Yeah, I think think the microphone, is the microphone on? Yes, it is. We have one question back here, then we'll go up front and we'll alternate as need be.
So basically what you're proposing is that all creative art or all just creative thoughts should coincide with currency?
Should coincide
With currency, money.
No.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, what's the point of ownership, period? All artists steal from all artists. Is that wrong?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right, that all artists in every discipline that you can imagine end up working from the material around them, right? And they're inspired by the people around them. They're inspired by the history of their craft. It's a very natural thing. It's an instinct. And it's one reason that people often get caught copying other people's work or taking, and they'll say, I didn't even realize I did that. It's such a natural sort of process. And one of my arguments is that in the fashion industry, you're not sued because you do that. So the natural sort of creative impulse to draw from the material around you and to echo what's happening in the world right now is actually a legal process. But in the music industry, with painters, with filmmakers, they're really not in the same situation at all. And I'd say many of them complain bitterly because they do not have the opportunity to make the artwork that they want to make because they're afraid that they're going to be sued. But when it comes to the money side, I guess I wanted to make the point that a lot of people do equate ownership with money. Other people equate ownership with moral rights, right? I'm an author of something, I don't want people to mess with it, right? It needs to stay the way it is. And that's actually one reason that one of the Creative Commons licenses is that you can choose to apply. You can give up all kinds of the rights that copyright grants you, but you can claim you can't change this object. You can't alter it. You can share it with other people, but it's going to have my name on it, and it has to look like this.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, just talking to you earlier and knowing your history about working with the media and kind of just doing research with the masses, I was kind of wondering, thoughts came to mind that where do you think from your research of everything you've done, where does the fashion come from? Does it come from the rich and the fashionable, or the poor and the fashionless, or the middle class and that just copy everyone? I mean, where do you think most of that fashion comes from in our society?
Well, it really depends on the place. One thing that's really great about fashion is that it's very site-specific in a way. I mean, obviously we have a global fashion industry, but I can guarantee you the collection in one H&M is going to be different from the collection in another one, even across town. Yeah, I see people are nodding. So there's a sensitivity to geographic location. And I just read this really interesting report about the fashion industry in Rio. And what they wanted to do is figure out whether fashion designers were furious that they didn't own their designs. And they wanted to see how the industry was working. How did the knockoff industry knock off the carioca style of the Rio beach, bikini wear and all this stuff? How was that functioning? And what they found is that people were generally flattered when they were knocked off, and that they were very deeply influenced by the favelas, those are the very poor barrios in the hills where people have very distinctive style, a style that the rich fashion designers in the expensive parts of Rio, like in Copacabana Beach, were actually inspired by. So they're basically making favela gangster wear, right, for really rich tourists who are coming to Copacabana. And that became sort of what Rio was about, sort of edgy, informal wear that was also extremely sexy. So in just that example, you can see how complicated the whole sort of creative ecology is. It's not just top down, it's not bottom up. There's this very interesting sort of mingling that occurs and helps really define a city. People think they know what Rio sort of means, and there's a whole fashion system in place there that tries to articulate that idea in clothing.
Dr. Blakley, I think you did a great job in explaining the democracy of style, and this idea how we communicate with the outside world, our style via clothing, and how access to clothing normally associated with the upper echelons of society is empowering. And I get that. I think you did a brilliant job in explaining that. One counterpoint, though, that I'm thinking of is the implications of not having intellectual property rights on developing countries, and how with these companies can afford to do that, but when we have creative people in developing countries that have these great styles, how companies can just come in and kind of take over, essentially, and take their clothing styles and mimic it, and because they have all the resources, they can easily mobilize it. And I'd like to get your thoughts on how intellectual property rights work versus developed countries and underdeveloped countries.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I'm just surprised the direction that you took it, because usually most of the complaints go the other way, is that it's first world countries that make very expensive popular fashion designs that people in third world countries copy and knock off at will. And one of their biggest complaints among the big luxury designers is that it's in the second world and third world countries where you see the most piracy of trademark, right? So that tends to be the big complaint, is that it's in the second and third world countries that they're taking full advantage of the lack of copyright, and they're violating trademark. But one interesting thing about textile designs, a lot of people have, over the years, different fashion designers have become obsessed with certain kinds of textile designs from India or from Southeast Asia or from different regions in Africa. And one kind of interesting thing is that that's one thing that fashion designers actually do own, is the textile design, because it's a two-dimensional design. It's an illustration, it's a painting, right? It's a drawing. And so people can actually enforce their copyright when it comes to textile design. And often that's the main thing that's coming out of countries like India and Africa in terms of influential fashion. And it's the fashion designers outside of those countries that are popularizing those textiles. But the people who made them actually should be remunerated. So, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Blakley. I have a two-part question. The first part you talked about.
Is the mic on? Can everybody hear you?
Can you hear me?
There we go.
There we go. Sorry about
Good,
that.
good.
Thank you so much for your insight and sharing everything in this type of industry. I'm a graphic designer, and I've been doing this for about 15 years. And you're talking about how the industry moves so fast, and it's actually getting more accelerating. Have you noticed that there's like a high burnout, rate in this industry, to where people come in and they come out? Can you give any insight on the sustainability on the creative industry, just because it's moving so fast, and where do people go once they're burned out, or what do you do? Because you're in public policy, and I'm looking to move forward in that type of industry. But where do you go, and what do you do after you've been on the bottom side, moving up, and then you just hit that burnt out? How do you get people to come up behind you and still sustain the industry, and still make it appealing?
Right, right. No, it's a really good question. And I must say, one distinctive aspect of the fashion industry is that it is insanely fast-paced, and there's a huge amount of burnout. And so for certain kinds of creative people, this is the perfect industry for them. They're never bored. They always have a new idea. Whatever was cool yesterday is not cool today. I need to do something else. If you watch Project Runway, you'll see these personality types. So it definitely attracts a certain kind of personality type. But that's certainly not the only kind of fashion that succeeds. Some designers have found a very specific niche. Rick Owens, for instance, I don't know if you've heard of him. He makes a very sort of narrow palette of designs. He has a very specific design aesthetic. He barely changes anything each season, and he sells out every single item. He's just tapped into something that works for people. It's very wearable, it's very comfortable. He's probably my favorite designer. And he lives a very comfortable life in Paris. He bought the Italian factory that he used to have to, it's very hard for designers to get access to the really good factories. It's very much a pecking order. So he bought the whole damn factory. So he's just resting on his laurels. He doesn't have to worry about being pushed behind Prada or pushed behind Chanel. He's always first in line because he owns the factory. So there are certain success stories where you can see where people can sort of comfortably relax. But usually the only kind of stasis that you see in the fashion industry is among the highest level luxury brands. Right? Alexander McQueen killed himself recently. He's no longer alive. But his fashion label is thriving because the woman who worked with him, Sarah Burton, has taken over, and she's managed to keep articulating his vision. She's tapped into what it was about his style that people loved, and she continues to keep that sensibility alive. And you find that with all the big fashion houses. They have a very particular sort of sensibility, and it's the responsibility of the team to keep it alive. And so there's a certain kind of trajectory of tradition, surprisingly, within certain echelons of fashion. But generally, for people coming in, it's terrifying. It's really fast-paced, roller coaster crazy. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a second part to that.
Oh, well, actually, we have so many people back here. Afterwards, I'll talk with you afterwards. Okay. Okay, back here.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. One of the last things I noticed you mentioned was a need for fostering multiple disciplinary research. It kind of crude, but you yourself seem a very cultured person with a lot of disciplinary study. Yeah. So kind of a vague question, but what would you recommend for students trying to obtain the same thing, primarily research in pop culture specifically, I suppose?
What would I suggest in terms of curriculum you take in order to prepare yourself for a bizarre career path like mine?
Yeah, what kind of recommendations would you make for someone looking to obtain the same goals?
Well, the key thing for me is I chose English because I thought it covered everything. Since literature was about everything, then I thought I could know a lot about everything. So that sort of suited me. But I felt very restricted by what a traditional academic pursuit it is. That there's only specific journals you're supposed to publish in, and that really irritated me. And what really changed my life was when I first was introduced to the World Wide Web. You know, it was something that was new when I was in graduate school. And I decided that digital technology was going to change everything. And that's when I left academia, actually. So what I ended up doing is I got this really great education in understanding, being able to critically read the world. I learned how to read, I learned how to write really well, and then I went to a huge multimedia game company and I learned about digital technology. And it was like my second PhD. I always tell people that. So I think if you can marry together these very traditional skills of being able to communicate with people about very complicated things in in ways that show that you understand how to speak to an audience, right? That's part of my career, is speaking to audiences, finding a way to build a bridge, right? Once you have that communication skill set, then I think it's really important that you learn the digital tools. You learn what technology is available to you to do your work. And once you have those two things in place, you can do anything. So, yes.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was truly the highlight of my week.
Oh,
I
love that.
I especially love.
I love your top. Where'd you get that?
Old Navy, the whole outfit. I swear to God.
Oh my God, they have some geniuses working there.
See, I think they were knocking off somebody better though, but now I feel kind of bad about it. But I love that you talked about the collaborations with Missoni and Target. I personally got up at 6 a.m. to get about 12 pieces. And there were.
Did you sell them on eBay?
I did not sell them on eBay, and that's actually my question. It really upset me when I got home because there were so many more things that I wanted because I'd been stalking the whole collection and lookbooks on style blogs. It made me so mad when I got home and there was 40,000 items on eBay, but on Target website, you know, it was shut down for 48 hours, and all these hardworking people who can't afford the real Missoni are missing out, and now it's $150 for a $39.99 blanket. For you having your hands-on experience with design houses and your research, do they recognize that's a problem, and is it a problem for them?
Oh yeah. They did not understand exactly how big this was going to be. They had some live events that they had scheduled in New York as well. They had to cancel almost all of them because they sold out at the very first one. They totally got overrun. So I don't know, if they had talked to me, I could have told them, hello, Missoni and Target is perfect. I have been waiting for years for this to happen. So, I mean, on the upside, I'm sure they like the fact they got a ton of media coverage, right? And this is all about marketing for a company like Missoni, because they're not going to make as much money, probably, who knows, at Target as they are selling their luxury line of goods. And they sell yachts. They decorate yachts. I want one. Oh my God, they're so gorgeous. So what they really needed was name recognition, and now guess what? We're all talking about it. But I think they mishandled it. I think they did not realize what a beautiful match they had on their hands, and I'm just appalled that they didn't have more inventory. But believe me, they're going to do it again. There's so much money to be made.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Back here?
Yeah, I had a question about, well, first of all, you showed the graphic. It was the graph that showed the amount of revenue that certain industries received.
Yeah.
Like the food industry, it had no copyright laws basically, but it's still receiving a ton of revenue. And then if you looked towards the bottom, there was the music industry. And first of all, would you be saying that the music industry itself could be suffering from not having, or from having too many copyright laws? Just a question I have, because me, myself, I'm not focusing on fashion, but I am focusing on music. And I just, with any industry, you want to go into it with the right mindset so that you can be successful. So with you having so much knowledge about that type of way of using these industries, what type of advice would you give into going into an industry with so much copyright laws?
Oh, the music industry is a mess right now, I hate to tell you. It's really hard to make any money or make a living in the music industry. It's always been tough for musicians to make money in the music industry. It just used to be that recording industry executives made a lot of money. And now they don't even make a lot of money anymore either. But they're changing with the times. They kind of have to. And one of the key things that you see the industry focusing on is live events, merchandise. These are the things they know they can sell. So they're starting to get the mindset in place that, well, I can't really depend on my copyright anymore, even though that's the way I made money before. Maybe I will let the illegal copies of the music circulate so that I can drive up attendance to a concert. And maybe I will come up with some really innovative ways that fans can have some sort of access to my artists. I'll have chat rooms, we'll have special events. So you'll see more and more of these kinds of ploys where the digital object becomes something that no longer can be sold. But it's a calling card. It's something that gets people interested and excited. It's marketing. And what ends up being sold are those one-on-one encounters, the real-life physical encounters, the rival goods, as they're called, the ticket you have to pay at the door in order to get in. That's the only way you can experience it. And you're going to see that a lot more in industries that used to depend on selling copies. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, first of all, for the speech. I feel like you proved what the better of us kind of sensed was already going on, and I thank you so much for that, which is just, like, for musicians, just branching off the same idea, since I am a musician, it feels like the more that we change and become digitalized, and the more that record companies fight the idea of counterfeiting, the more counterfeiting happens, and the less money musicians make and everything. So first of all, thank you for that. And when we really look at the logic behind this idea of like copyrights and how seemingly less laws equals more freedom and more democratization of these ideas. My first question then is, I kind of ponder, how did we possibly get into this situation? Like, how could we have possibly thought, let's just tie ourselves up in all these ropes and that'll, make everything better? So there's that, and I apologize if this is a two-pronged question then. The easy answer seems to be like human greed, or the, like, I deserve to have compensation for it. And if that's the answer, I wonder what might the music and film industries and other ones, tied up with these copyrights might look like if they had the same attitudes as such as the artists in Rio, where they feel flattered when someone repeats their imagery, whereas musicians nowadays are, give me money.
Yeah, it's a completely different mindset, and it's so hard to be a musician right now. I don't want to suggest that, they're all silly, why don't they just act like fashion designers? They're trying to make a living, and it's so hard. But to get back to the copyright logic, I believe, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but Thomas Jefferson wrote about why it is that that creative people should have a temporary ownership of any physically fixed idea that's manifest in a book, for instance. At the time, they didn't have sound recordings and films. But he thought there should be some intellectual property protection for a limited time. I believe it was 8 years. That was the length, or something like that. Now it's 75 years after the death of the author. So what sort of incentive does that give to the author to make something new when they're dead? Well, the reason this came about is basically because of corporations. It's Walt Disney that has been the driving force. They have been responsible for the continued extension of copyright protection. And you know why? Because Mickey Mouse was going to fall into the public domain. And they could not have that happen. So they lobbied Congress, and they have successfully convinced Congress repeatedly to keep lengthening the amount of time that copyright protection lasts. And there's a lot of very outraged people about this, a lot of legal scholars who are very upset about this. The guy who invented the Creative Commons actually testified before the Supreme Court about exactly this when they extended the copyright length again a few years ago. And what the Supreme Court said is, you know what, you're right, this is wrong, but it's not our decision to make, it's Congress. So I'm afraid it's a very political process, and I'm hoping at some point it's going to be righted. So I'm not sure, it's 8:15, do we have just, should we do one more? One more, okay, we'll do one more. I'll talk with you afterwards if you like. Okay.
Am I the one more? Am I the last one? This is a lot of pressure.
Oh, sorry, there you are. I was looking at this guy here. I'll talk to you afterwards. Okay. Go ahead.
You'll talk to me afterwards, too, because I have one question about Myriad Genetics owning the breast cancer.
What?
Yeah, I'll talk to you about that after. The question I have right now that kind of pertains to this is the rise in the tattoo and piercing culture.
Oh, yeah.
Do you believe that when this generation enters the workforce after college, that that corporate America is going to become more laxed, or do you believe that just tattoos or piercings are going to be something hidden under
Really, you're
sleeves?
asking a question about tattoos? That's awesome. Well, certainly in LA, it's much more acceptable than it's ever been for people to have tattoos and show them off. I mean, I see marketing executives from big film studios sporting tattoos. I mean, they're everywhere. And for a lot of people, they are a demonstration of a certain kind of street cred, right? So in some industries, it's actually beneficial to have tattoos and show them off. They're usually creative industries, edgy industries, industries that are related to trend forecasting, you know, this kind of stuff. But, you know, it's hard for me to say exactly what's going to happen in the future. What we've seen generally is that corporate culture has become more informal and more casual, and the sensibility that you have to be wrapped up in a three-piece suit and in order to be taken seriously is something that is really eroded in American culture. If any of you watch Mad Men, you see the difference between the kinds of clothes they were wearing then and what you often see now. I hope that sort of answers your question, but we can talk about breast cancer afterwards. All right, thank you so much. Thank you.